Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Visual Studio 2010 and .NET Framework 4 Learning on Channel 9. This week, we're going to take a look at the content and features that we're introducing in ASP.NET 4. So first, before we talk about the specific features, I want to kind of disambiguate the overall ASP.NET stack. So I've talked to a lot of developers, and in the past, ASP.NET as a term has become somewhat synonymous for specifically web forms. And moving forward, we want to start to think about ASP.NET as an ecosystem of components that some you can choose, swap out, and then others complement each other very well. So at the core, at the base of ASP.NET is the core runtime, right? And that is the stuff that is generic to the server and any presentation framework you choose on top of that. So then sitting on top of the runtime is MVC and then web forms, which provides you two different options for how you want to do your presentational aspects of your web application. So this becomes interesting and compelling, especially as we start to think about new features being added to what product and how that actually affects it. In that if a feature is added to the core, then whether you're a web forms developer or an MVC developer, you're going to be able to benefit from that some way. But features that are specific to web forms and MVC, of course, aren't going to translate. So then, on top of that is the ASP.NET Ajax release, which, moving forward with the 4.0, right, it's much more client-centric. So there's great integration with web forms, there's integration with MVC, as well as you don't even have to have ASP.NET on the server. But that is an option. So now that we just kind of have a brief overview of the stack, let's dig into the individual components and see what's coming in ASP.NET 4. So first and foremost, at the core of ASP.NET, the runtime, there's a whole ton of new options and features that were added that are going to make your life as an ASP.NET dev, regardless of web forms or MVC, much easier. So one of my favorite features, and anybody that's been doing ASP.NET for a long time is going to appreciate this, and that is web.config minification. So if you've been doing ASP.NET since 1.0, or even 2.0 for that matter, you've noticed that since ASP.NET 2.0 and now, the web.config file has gotten quite huge. And the reason for that is because we haven't introduced a new CLR and we haven't overridden the machine.config to include the new stuff that we've tacked on with each release. So with .NET 2 there was a bunch of stuff, with 3 there was new stuff, with 3.5 there was new stuff, 3.5 SP1 there was new stuff, and so the web.config file was just growing and growing and growing. Well, now with ASP.NET 4 and the .NET Framework 4, the web.config, most of the settings were moved to the machine.config file, and so now you have this nice, clean web.config file when you create a new project. It's easy, intuitive, you don't have to drudge through all of those kind of boilerplate settings. So the other thing is the object cache. So since the beginning of time, ASP.NET has had the notion of a cache object, right? And that object stored data in memory on the server. And this was a really nice, just kind of memory cache, pretty much general purpose, no frills, really easy to use. And in fact, it was so easy and so compelling to use that a lot of developers ended up using it outside of ASP.NET. So you had web forms guys, you had WPF guys that were importing the system.webassembly just to use the cache mechanism in ASP.NET. That was a little awkward. And other than that, also you can think it wasn't extensible, in that it was kind of this black box and there was nothing you could do about it. And so what if you wanted to store your cache in a different mechanism other than just in server RAM? You couldn't really. So in ASP.NET 4, we've refactored the caching mechanism out into a new assembly, system.runtime.caching, made it generic to the framework, so it's no longer specific to ASP.NET, as well as it made it extensible. So out of the box, there's an implementation that gives you the same in-memory caching mechanism you already know and love. But if you want to create your own that stores cache data to disk or into the cloud or to a distributed memory cache like Velocity, you can do that, right? And so you might begin to see those additional implementations come from Microsoft or third parties, and that's going to provide better behavior for developers in general. So let's talk about Web Forms 4. So there's a lot of web forms developers out there, and a lot of people think that there's a lot of love going to MVC right now. And the case is that I wanted people to look very closely on the Web Forms 4 release and see just how much is in there. in that it's a massive release for web forms, tons of new features, lots of improvements, which really goes to show our commitment to the product, and that we've really said, hey, this goes to show that if you're doing web forms today, it's a strong platform. So two of the things that I especially like are the client IDs. So if you're a web developer, no doubt you're starting to see a trend where web applications are becoming more client-centric, right? Whether that's having JavaScript, or you want to be able to do things with CSS and have much more control over your page's rendering and functionality. And with server controls and web forms in the past, you typically might have had a problem where the server control, its ID was refactored based on the control hierarchy that it lived in. Maybe it was a master page or other nested user controls. And so this kind of made it tricky to target from script or CSS. There was hacks that people did. You'd put a CSS class on there to target it, and it was just really not a great solution. So in Web Forms 4, you now have the ability to say, this is the ID of this server control, and that ID is static, so do not change it when you render it to the client. So that's a very small thing, but it ends up being a big feature that a lot of developers are going to benefit from. So finally, the thing that I think is going to have the biggest impact is the server control revamp. And that we looked across every single server control in web forms, which is about 80 or so, and said, how can we make the HTML it renders better? How can we make it more semantic? How can we remove any unnecessary inline styling? And how can we just, in general, provide more control to the developer? So now what you'll notice is that all the controls that rendered themselves as kind of tables, just really nasty HTML, such as the menu, checkbox list control, so forth and so on, that is no longer there, in that the menu control now renders in a nice unordered list. Checkbox list could be an unordered list or an ordered list. You have the option there. Then you have other controls that would allow you to specify a template, so like the form view control, for instance, but it would wrap your template content in a kind of superfluous table and a TD. So now in ASP.NET 4, you have the option to say, don't render that table, give me full control over the rendered markup. So that ends up being a huge feature for web forms developers. Really, we see Web Forms 4 as being a release that says, we want to give you all of the control you want. Client ID, server control rendering, so forth and so on. So definitely don't let anyone tell you that this isn't a huge release for web forms. So in addition to web forms, kind of an extension to web forms is dynamic data, right? This was introduced in .NET 3.5 SP1, and what this does is provide the functionality to web forms to make data-centric applications really easy to develop. So what that had is kind of two flavors. There was the scaffolding approach where you do the file new, and you point at a data model, and you have an entire application to edit and modify your data with validation, metadata, so forth and so on. It was really nice. But there was also a lot of developers who said, hey, I already have an existing application. I don't want to create a new one. I want full control over the app. But it would be nice if I kind of could bring in some of the dynamic data behavior into my existing application. And you could. With the first version of dynamic data, it was easy to do, but it wasn't as easy as it could be. So now in Dynamic Data 4, we have a single line configuration where if you have a class in your data model, for instance, and you've annotated it with the attributes to say validation rules and metadata, you can, with one line of code, tell the grid view control that when its data is bound to it, it should enable dynamic data for this type. So person, for instance. And then when it's building out the rows, it'll use the dynamic data behavior for a few things to enable metadata and validation. So if a field is required and you try to submit a record without filling in a value, it'll catch that for you. And then as well as templates, in that based on the type of the data bound to each field in a grid view, it'll look and say, what type is this? Is there a custom field template that I should be using? And so forth and so on. So the exact same behavior that you would expect from dynamic data in web forms, but making it easy to do with one line of code in an existing application. And that works for all the data controls, not just grid view. So list view, form view, and so forth and so on. So finally, another very small but big feature is the support for inheritance. So if you're using Entity Framework or Link to SQL, you know that when you model your data models, you can have an inheritance chain. So for instance, you might have customer and then a VIP customer. But dynamic data wasn't capable of really seeing the difference between the two, in that if you had special properties or additional properties on VIP customer, those were effectively lost. So now in Dynamic Data 4, it now is able to support and understand inheritance, so your model is then respected in the scaffolded application. Okay, so MVC2. So ASP.NET MVC1 was released earlier this year, and it came out as an out-of-band release, right? Well, now ASP.NET MVC2 is going to be in the box with Visual Studio 2010. So what this does is it kind of says, hey, any developers who maybe were looking for an excuse to get up to speed with it and try it out, here it is. It's right there for you. If you download the whole suite, you're going to get MVC as well. Now, speaking of dynamic data and saying how that was data-driven functionality for web forms, MVC2 really brings a lot of that data-centric functionality, but into the MVC space. And two main features that really enable this are templated helpers and then model metadata and validators. Excuse me. In that, templated helpers basically provide you the same field template support that dynamic data does for web forms, and that you can have custom field templates for certain types. So if you have a person class and you want to have a partial control that determines how a person should render, there's now a helper that you can say html.editor4 and then pass it a person object. It'll then be smart enough to go find the right template. In addition to that, if you're just using native types like strings and dates and so forth, it'll automatically provide default templates for those types, and then it'll look at the type or the property that you're binding to the helper and say, are there any attributes that are on that or any metadata and validation that I need to uphold? In that, does this field need to be required? Is there a regular expression constraint? And so forth and so on. Now, the great thing is I said data annotations in that, yeah, you can do that, but that's only one default implementation. MVC2 is actually generic in the sense of where it gets its metadata from, as well as its validation. So you could just as easily create an entire provider for MVC2 that worked against Entity Enterprise Library or even the Castle Validation Framework. So regardless of what your flavor of configuration there for kind of model metadata and validation, you can have it just as easily and it'll work. So in addition to server-side validation, you also have now client validation as well. So MVC2 will ship with the jQuery validation plugin, and what that'll do is that'll provide you client-side validation from the server-side validation that you applied on the server. So you kind of get the best of both worlds, and it just really is easy to use. Okay, so finally, ASP.NET AJAX 4. So for those that are unfamiliar with it, this release is all about enabling client-centric web development to become much easier. And that kind of in the past, ASP.NET AJAX has been somewhat about enabling web forms developers to kind of have an AJAX-like experience where you had nice server controls and the script manager and partial rendering and so forth. But now with ASP.NET AJAX 4, we want to say, if you want to do your own JavaScript code and you want a pure, quote-unquote, client application, here's bits that will make it easy for you to do it. So there's a whole lot of things in there, a ton more than I can talk about, but one of the main features is the notion of client templates. So if you're doing a client-centric application, typically one of the problems you're going to run into is needing to do some type of dynamic UI, right? So you make a call to the server, data comes back, and you need to update the UI based on that data. And you might need to build out some more HTML and so forth and so on. So client templates allows you to define a template in HTML and basically say, I want to bind data to that and then have it build out that template for me. And that alleviates the need for you in JavaScript to build up a massive string of HTML or even do a bunch of document.create elements and so forth and so on. So if you're doing that type of experience, client templates makes it a lot easier. There's also a new script loader behavior, which makes it easy to be able to pull down scripts lazily, in that let's say your entire web application needs 10 to 15 JavaScript files, but there's only 1 or 2 needed on any given page. So some people might say, oh, I'll just reference them all in a master, but then you're wasting bandwidth because the client has to download a bunch of unnecessary scripts. But then do you have a custom file include or script includes on every single page? With the script loader, for every script file, you can basically just say, hey, I need these components or these scripts, and if you don't have them, then load them for me, and then I'll do my job. So that makes doing client-centric development a lot easier as well. And then finally, you're going to start to see more and more jQuery integration, in that now with ASP.NET Ajax 4, any controls or plugins or custom scripts that you write for ASP.NET Ajax are going to also work for jQuery and vice versa. We also have our query ability, so when you say sys.get, for instance, and pass it a query to say this element with this ID or so forth, it will fall back to using jQuery if the query you specified is anything other than a class name, element, or ID. So you're going to still benefit from having those rich expressive queries that you can do in jQuery using ASP.NET Ajax 4. So with that, that represents the entire kind of whirlwind tour of ASP.NET 4. There's a ton coming, right? MVC, Web Forms, Dynamic Data, Core, Ajax. I only touched on a few things, but I had everything else listed there kind of to give you an idea in your mind to kind of keep note of. But I encourage you, we have 5 hands-on labs that go along with this content. Go out to those labs, run through them. You're going to get a much deeper learning of each of the different feature sets, and then also stay tuned to the Channel 9 learning courses to see brand new content. Thanks again, and stay tuned till next time.